So I'd like to start by learning a little more about each of your introductions to this kind of work. Each of you, I would say, is certainly a changemaker, but I think that that's less of a job title and more of a personal description. So let's get each of you to share something of the experience that first pulled you into this kind of work. So what was going on in the world around you at the time? The political climate, the big ideas, and how did that shape your view of the world? So let's start with you, Julien, and we'll work our way around.
Is it on now? Oh yeah, it's on. Hi everyone. So, funnily enough, when I stepped into this room, I was met with a kind of a reunion that summed up how I got into the work that I do. And Changemaker should be a job title, by the way. We need them. We need a lot of them. So
I was just thinking I might add that to my LinkedIn.
Okay, so we're talking turn of the millennium, late 90s. We're talking Howard era politics. Environment movements of the day would be about forestry, about logging native forests. Every World Environment Day, the main rally in the city would be about that issue. I grew up being inspired by people like Bob Brown and the emergent Wilderness Society Greens movement that came from that. And then I went to university with the intention to be a weatherman, get a meteorology degree. And I learned a couple of things. Is Caroli in the room? Yeah. So his fault. I learned two things from him. One was that I sucked at maths, so I was never going to become a meteorologist. The second was this was around the time of one of the IPCC reports coming out around 2001, the third assessment report, and the scary level just went through the roof. And so I'm getting graphs on slides from Professor Caroli's lectures and turning these graphs in my mind into impacts, terrifying impacts of sea level rise, impacts on communities, people retreating inland, conflicts over resources, and that was my oh shit moment. And at the same time, is Pete here? Yeah. So I ended up going to the Environment Collective at Monash University and met Pete, who's sitting halfway back there, and a bunch of other people, and started to get involved in environmental projects on campus and protest around the old classic HECS fee increases on campus and here in the city. And so it was a kind of a combination of that awakening on climate and just discovering the joy of activism that got me on the track. And I probably spent about 5 years volunteering, being a really rubbish activist, and then started to get professional work as a campaigner. I was probably a rubbish campaigner for a few years, and then started to get better and started to win campaigns, and then worked out why I was winning campaigns and started Market Forces and took off from there.
That's great. I think we talked a little earlier about what to do in the face of failure. So there's another approach for you. Give up on meteorology and become a climate campaigner.
Right, David?
Tegan?
So my first step into this work was around the 2019-2020 bushfires. I had just finished my undergrad in commerce and was feeling incredibly uninspired by a career selling shit. And yeah, I think like seeing how that impacted my community up in the mid-North Coast, it was crazy. And then living in Sydney at the time, I was like impacted by the bushfire smoke, but I just genuinely didn't really know where to go to figure out what I could do to help. And I decided the best thing to do was to go back to uni to study a Masters of Sustainability, which I also did at Sydney Uni. And that degree changed my life. I learnt so much, and I just was like, oh my God, everyone needs to know this information. And in classic Gen Z form, decided to start an Instagram account and post about the stuff I was learning. Also because my degree cost $60,000, which at the time I didn't care about, but now I'm like, oh my God, my HECS. But I was like, that's such a barrier to knowledge that shouldn't be there. So again, I was like, I'm going to post about this on Instagram and hopefully someone will read it. Maybe it'll just be my friends, but that's fine because at least then I'm sharing my knowledge with them. And through that, met my co-founder of Project Planet, Lizzie, again on Instagram. And yeah, just since then, from about 2021, we have been working together to figure out how we can best connect people who care about the climate with climate solutions, those people that genuinely do want to help but have no idea what to do. And I've been doing that in lots of different cool ways, including Build-A-Ballot this year.
Sorry, I'm like in my mind going. Classic. Probably know what generation I'm from. Not just jokes. But well, I was just as I was hearing. I so interesting. Like summer, like that was such an imprinting moment for me as well to really think about. Wow, we're in such a critical decade, like those bushfires, and since 2020, we've actually like started a year and finished a year with a fire or a flood. Like that's so hectic. And so, hi everyone, cup of kuts, good afternoon. One of the biggest things for me when I was sort of growing up, and I'm thinking, so I'm a millennial, but I grew up in a really small mining town that was really extractive, and I had the privilege to learn from and was able to go on country and learn from some of the elders on our school holidays. So sort of like summer camp, but it was just really cool to sort of learn from others' traditional knowledge and like cooking damp fire wrapped around banana leaves and cooking it on coal and sort of those underground ovens. I'm like, yes, food. One of the biggest things when I was going back to the Torres Strait Islands was that during that time in the early 90s, we sort of had this really incredible man, Ate Koikoi Mabo, who was working towards, change in our country for native title rights. And during that time, a lot of people didn't know, but a lot of the Torres Strait Islands and communities that were dependent on sort of like catching fish with their traditional methods were being restricted of how much food we can eat. So we couldn't eat our traditional resources like turtle and dugong. And I know that may seem a little bit different for folks here in the room, but it was a traditional dish that we've lived together in harmony in seasons with our natural food resources. And I was thinking about you, Alex, presenting about sort of regenerative practices on agricultural food systems and the impacts of sort of that nexus point of climate impacting food security and how much at risk we are at. And for me, it was really, I didn't understand what was sort of happening like, I guess, federally with Ate Koikoi Mabo. But what I knew was that people were telling us about where we could fish and how we could fish. And that just seemed really, really odd to something that we'd been sort of really raised knowing and growing up with. And that to me was like a really, really pivotal turning point, because then I just started becoming really curious and asking questions. Adults thought it was back chat, but I was just like, no, that seems wrong. But, I think that curiosity sort of really got me to where I'm sort of at now, of really trying to challenge that status quo and really being at sort of like at the heart of like, the work that we do. Thank you. Sharan.
Wow. First of all, I love Tish, so, we've interacted before. But Lynn, I feel like the grandmother on this panel. And not only that, but not only are you all young, suffice John and a couple of others I see, but in fact they're really tough. Look, I'm freezing and they're, got shirts on.
It had to be someone, Sharan.
Yeah, exactly. I've been in too many hot countries, I guess. But look, I'm going to carbon date myself badly, but I went to school in the early 70s. And it was a hotbed of change. I walked onto a campus. I'd already been a student activist around the Vietnam War and a moratorium. I can see some nodding in the room over there. The career counsellor for you, you know. But and snuck out of, you know, home and sat on the steps of local councils to protest the draft and so on. But then I went to university and it was anti-apartheid, so we demonstrated outside the hotels where the Springboks were, and we, you know, gave asylum to people fleeing from South Africa whose lives are at risk and so on. And it was the third wave of feminism. And we thought there was nothing we couldn't change. So for me, campaigning has been everything. And I then made a life out of it, you know. I've just stepped down 2 years ago from the most privileged job in the world, where I could make trouble anywhere in the world I wanted to, as the head of the global labour movement. But I also had to be responsible for thinking through what the solution was. But circa right through that to 2000, and I read my first IPCC report cover to cover. I had, full disclosure, I had led community campaigns, chained ourselves to trees, done all of that. Bit of an odd trade unionist, but I was often called in to help keep the peace between those who were environmental activists or environmentally minded, and our jobs in forestry and so on. But in 2000, I took over as president of the ACTU, and I read my first IPCC report cover to cover. Not the headlines, not the commentary, but cover to cover. I thought I was reading a horror novel. I read it again in 2001, and then in 2002, I told the Australian union movement, blue collar, white collar, you name it, that this was the biggest systemic change we would face in our lifetime. We couldn't avoid it. It was like a train coming at you, and we better get ahead of it. I wasn't universally popular, have a few scars on my back, but then we started a campaign internationally around the COPs, and, you know, for us there are no jobs on a dead planet. That was our slogan. And then when I took over the global movement, I had to actually, the campaign we'd initiated, which was fun when you were prodding leaders to get behind it, suddenly I was responsible for. So we had to build in a broad community the kind of campaign that brought people together. And of course, it was the campaign around just transitions, because most workers will tell you that many industrial transitions all around the world have not been very just in terms of workers or communities. And many communities have been stranded. I can take you through those communities in any country. But we got just transitions in the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, and we got human rights. But I woke up the next day after all the celebrations, and it was the worst morning of my life, because I thought, I can't say an expletive in this room, but oh, you can guess it, we now have to deliver it. And so we had to figure out how to educate intergenerational unions and their communities about how to negotiate for an industrial revolution, really, in every industry. But I just want to say thank you, because I have had a life of campaigning, being part of campaigns, having responsibility for them, being a troublemaker, but also a solutions thought leader, I hope. But I love that session with the storytelling, because you can't run a campaign. You can't build common, you know, aspiration or emotional enthusiasm or support if you don't find them more in common, and narrative is everything. So to all of you, thank you very much, because I thought it was such a wonderful backdrop to this.
Let's do it. Thank you for that, Sharan. Now, something that came across to me, and really what all of you were saying there, is how you've centred community in the work that you've done. But community is something that means very different things to very different people. So I'm keen to know what it means to each of you in the context of the work that you do and in the change that you try and create. So I'll start with you, Tish. I know that community is a really core part of the work that you do in the Torres Strait Islands and abroad. But yeah, give us some quick thoughts and then we'll bounce it around.
Classic. Thanks, Harry. And building on what I had just shared before about sort of being on country in sort of like that sort of it growing up in sort of an extractive area was that I still, while I wasn't raised sort of on my island home, I was really nurtured and held by community. It wasn't, and when I say community, it was just a small regional town. Everyone knew everyone. You could ride your bikes until like 6 o'clock in the evening, and your parents can yell down the street saying, "Get in the house." And it was like really nice. I don't know if anyone's had that experience, but perhaps maybe that memory is something that I really hold dear to my heart, that was really shaped some of, the way that I move and, step in this world. And as I share this, it took me, how I sort of really got to sort of the advocacy that I do now is that I returned, while I'd been back to the Torres Strait Islands, I returned back to my home after 20 years since I'd last been there and actually seen firsthand these how erosion and king tides were stripping away our island home. And, I've shared this before, and some of you folks know, but one of my first times when I arrived was that I had to go pick up the bones of my, my uckers, like seashells on the beach. And that moment of like memories that you had with these people, that, when you've, whether you've gone into the house and eaten food, sat down with them, with your grandparents, aunties and uncles, it felt really disrespectful. It felt like what a dishonor it is to, as you've served and been able to provide a future for us, younger seeds, we, what is our responsibility and duty to continue to look after those that have gone before us. And, that was one of the pivotal moments that sort of really, I guess, got me into this space and really at the heart of like community is that my island home, Musig Island, has just been impacted by sea levels rising at a rate where now we can't use our traditional practices to adapt because the I guess pollution is just so severe. Health, Stuart, when you were just talking about the health intersection and how it takes like 200 days to sort of go through the process to get back to where you were. For our communities, we don't even have a nurse on my island home, let alone a doctor. And so when we talk about the environment as we celebrate here for World Environment Day, we have to know the things in our environment so that when we get a cut or a sting, we're able to quickly put an antidote on there so that we can go through other natural processes to help support and cure, because our islands and our land and our ocean is our medicine. And so it was the knowledge from our community that shared that, and I realized that I'm taking so long. Mm-hmm. Oh my God. And so I guess community being able to knowing that on the shoulders, that responsibility of education, how I be the best advocate I can in this space. Thank you.
Thank you, Tish. I'll throw to you now, Julien, because the work that you've done has motivated a very different kind of community, and obviously empowering the community to campaign for change is the core of the success of any kind of campaign. So how have you drawn on the spirit of the people to make sure that the work that you've done has been successful, and how do you keep that momentum going? Yeah,
it's an annoyingly complex question because I want to try and give a nice succinct answer. I've got 2 minutes, okay. You're fine. As a campaigner, my job as a campaigner and your job if you're a campaigner is to make people do things that they probably don't want to do to start with. Get that policy change, get that commitment to reduce emissions from that company, stop that dirty project, get that clean project built, whatever it might be, and overcome resistance. So you have an objective, you know what you want to do, and then the question is strategy. Who do you need to do what to get the outcome. So the first point of connection that I make is, who are the people we're going to need to engage with and activate to make the change happen? Which then makes this a lot more nebulous, because then we start to sow the seeds of the communities we need to tap into, but then they exist in their own communities, and we need to start to put down some connections and make those connections genuinely with people so that we can actually engage them meaningfully and make them feel powerful because they are powerful. So we need to be able to give people access and to be able to see the power they genuinely have. Whether it's, you might be thinking about the campaigns around Australian banks, giving people power and not showing them that power as bank customers, or if it's shareholders, or if it's some other point of connection, maybe as a member of staff within a company, and work with them to help them tap into that. I'm trying to get a result. And the thing that I need to be mindful of is to not let that make the connections that I have or that other campaigners have with people is just purely transactional. Because I think that creates a superficiality that just detracts from the meaning of that connection. I think it undermines the process, which then makes it harder for an organisation that wants to exist for the long term, because the communities you need to work with and build will shift from one issue and one campaign to another. So that's a perennial issue for an organisation that's trying to make change. And then at the same time, you're trying to, through the validity of your own issue, build your own community that can come with you and continue to support the work that you do. So I don't know if I'm under 2 minutes, but I just want to give a sense of that's the very complex, myriad way in which we need to think about community. Who do we need now? How do we engage with them meaningfully? How do we give them power, real power? And then who are we going to need for the long term? How do we build this group of people that's going to back us into the future so we can achieve more once we've achieved what we're going for now?
I think you've done pretty well.
Thanks.
So I'm going to talk about a different kind of power now, which is political power. So there's an old political adage that goes, if you're not a Liberal when you're 20, you have no heart. If you're not a Conservative by the time you're 40, you have no head. But I think the times are changing, and younger generations are moving to conservatism much more slowly as they get older. So there's data from the Australian election study that is showing that Gen Z is in fact completely bucking that trend and becoming more progressive as they age and at a rapid rate. So Tegan, I want to get your thoughts on this. Through your work with Build a Ballot this year, but also your personal experience, what do you think is driving Gen Z and millennials to take a different path than the generations that came before them?
Whoa, that was loud. I think that the system isn't built for young people. I think that is why young people are either less and less turning to conservative ideologies or just never arriving there in the first place. And yeah, sorry, I just wanted to bring it back to community as well, not to derail you, but a big part of what we strategized Build a Ballot around was the knowledge that people are most influenced by their friends and family in making voting decisions. So what we did was empower a small group of people as the people that would then be able to take the information we gave to them and share it with their circles of influence, which, yeah, it just goes to the fact that community, in whatever way that looks in your lives, is so important. And without those community ties, you don't feel like if you're not connected to a community, you're not going to make a change that impacts a group. So that is what keeps people going, and I think should underpin all of the work that we do, really, and the ability to foster that community and keep people feeling engaged in a community. But to answer your question, which I don't remember what it was. There would be plenty of different reasons. I think that the system just doesn't benefit us anymore. I think, speaking to your background in housing, housing was the biggest issue that people indicated in their voting decisions, in Build a Ballot at least. For those who don't know, 600,000 people used Build a Ballot to plan their vote for the federal election. So we captured a lot of data. And thank you. Yeah, and the first issue area that people were basing their voting decisions around was housing, and the second was the climate. And I think that there is much to be said about the links between those two, and the way that they're impacting each other, and there is a lot of good storytelling to be done in the ways that we can help people better understand the links between them. But yeah, when a housing market isn't benefiting a younger generation, of course we're going to continue voting for parties and candidates that are actually bringing forward policies that would impact us positively.
So I think it's fantastic that people are staying more progressive later. Let's hope that's a lifetime thing, because we need intergenerational power. And there is an adage in political power, what drives political power? If you want to make a change, bring your friends. And if you only got one group of friends, it's not going to be very influential. If you've got lots of different communities and groups of friends, it's going to be hugely influential, because the power of the ballot, but also just the overwhelming sense of voice. So whatever those communities are, local, global, they're really important, and the connection between them and age is even more critical. But I just wanted to say, when the world's in trouble, and it is right now on so many fronts, climate being and nature being at the forefront, but democracy at its heart, then the only power you can create is to go back to community. It's to find the more in common. And if you want to be inspired, and it was that photograph of the floods, I wrote a piece for the more progressive business leaders in the world just recently about Cyclone Alfred, or ex-Alfred as they call it. Why? Because it was the power of people from all walks of life engaging with each other. If you watched what happened, the neighbours who might have very different living standards, housing, issues, political views, they were all out there packing sandbags together. They were actually opening evacuation centres, staffing them with volunteers, providing food, actually clearing the way so emergency services could get in. It was a brilliant demonstration of when you've got more in common, then you have unity around what's important. And I would say, if we're going to have real political power, John Wiseman's in the room, he and Amanda and others have written a great book about this, but if you really want to inspire change, you've got to reach out to communities and bring everybody together and co-create the future.
Thank you, Sharan. So sadly, I'm being given the red X at the front. I would love to sit here for another 20 minutes with you guys, but in the half hour we have had, there's been some awesome ideas that have come up, and I think really what it's all come back to has been the power of people and the power of community, which I think is a pretty hopeful message to end on. Certainly food for thought as to how we refine our own personal change-making styles as we move forward. Now, we might not have given you all the answers, but what better place to find them than the 2025/26 Wattle Fellowship. So applications will be opening in a couple of months. This is a shameless plug, yes. So if you or someone that you know is interested in signing up, please find us on our website or our socials. It's very easy. It's Wattle Fellowship. Sign up to the mailing list and we'll keep you posted. So with that, please join me in thanking our fantastic panellists.